The most deformed sisters from Inbreeding. The real myth of the wolf. Women in the Ozark Hills, a forgotten chapter of American history that reveals how isolation and forbidden family unions created a legacy so disturbing that it transformed into local folklore. Deep within the mist-shrouded valleys of the Ozark Mountains, where sunlight barely penetrates the dense canopy of ancient oaks and pines, lies the dark history of the Blackwood family, whose multi-generational practice of consanguinity produced what local residents would later call the wolf women of Cane Creek Hollow. The year was 1937, when a young doctor named Thomas Harrington ventured into the remote hills of southern Missouri on a public health survey. What he discovered in a secluded cabin would haunt medical literature for decades to come and spawn whispered tales that still echo through the hollows today. "I have encountered something I cannot properly explain," wrote Dr. Harrington in his journal dated October 17, 1937. 3 female siblings with deformities so severe and unusual that the locals have taken to calling them wolf women. Their appearance, the elongated facial structure, the unusual hair growth, the curved spine and malformed extremities is unlike anything in my medical training. The Blackwood family had resided in these hills since before the Civil War, gradually retreating further from civilization as the decades passed. Through interviews with neighboring families, Dr. Harrington uncovered that the Blackwoods had practiced intermarriage between cousins for at least 4 generations. By the 1920s, the isolation had grown so complete that siblings began to form unions, creating a genetic catastrophe that manifested in Eliza, Mary, and Ruth Blackwood, aged 28, 26, and 19 respectively. The sisters lived in a crude 2-room cabin with their parents, Jeremiah and Sarah Blackwood, who were themselves first cousins. What shocked Dr. Harrington most was not just the sisters' appearance, but their isolation from medical care and education. None could read or write. Their speech was nearly unintelligible to outsiders. They moved with unusual gaits the local folklore had transformed into tallies of women who turned to wolves at night. The eldest, Eliza, presents with severe facial asymmetry, Dr. Harrington noted. Her jaw protrudes dramatically, and unusual hair growth covers portions of her face and neck. Her hands show severe malformation, with shortened fingers fused together in patterns consistent with genetic disorders. The middle sister, Mary, exhibits similar traits along with pronounced spinal curvature that forces her to walk in a hunched position. The youngest, Ruth, appears to have the most severe cognitive impairments, though her physical deformities are somewhat less pronounced. Local merchant William Cooper, who occasionally traded with Jeremiah Blackwood, told Dr. Harrington, "Folks round here been warned away from Cane Creek for years. Strange sounds come from there at night, not quite human, not quite animal. Some say those girls hunt through the woods after dark. Won't nobody go near that place after sundown?" The family's story exemplifies the devastating consequences of genetic isolation, while consanguinity itself carries risks of recessive genetic disorders. The Blackwoods represented an extreme case where multiple generations of inbreeding had concentrated and compounded these traits, creating a perfect storm of genetic abnormalities. What makes this case particularly significant is how the sisters' appearance led to their dehumanization in local folklore. Rather than being seen as victims of genetic misfortune and isolation, They were transformed into monsters, creatures to be feared rather than helped. This transformation of human suffering into mythology reveals much about how communities process and distance themselves from uncomfortable realities. Dr. Harrington's discovery would eventually lead to intervention by state authorities, but not before the sisters' existence had already become legend throughout the region, a cautionary tale whispered to disobedient children and discussed in hushed tones at general stores and church gatherings. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The disturbing truths about America's hidden history of genetic isolation will forever change how you see our rural past. The Blackwood sisters' story is just the beginning of what we're uncovering in America's forgotten hollows. The roots of the Blackwood family tragedy stretch back to the aftermath of the Civil War, when Jacob Blackwood, a Confederate veteran with nowhere to return, ventured deep into the Ozark wilderness. Historical records from Carter County indicate that Jacob arrived in the area around 1867, establishing a homestead in what was then virtually unmapped territory. The isolation wasn't accidental, it was deliberately sought. The Blackwoods always kept to themselves, recalled Henry Stilwell, aged 91, when interviewed in 1952 for a local historical society documentation project. My grandfather told me Jacob came here running from something. Nobody asked questions back then. These hills were full of men with pasts they didn't care to discuss. Jacob's first wife died during childbirth in 1869. Left with an infant son and miles from civilization, he eventually married his deceased wife's sister, Elizabeth Harmon, an acceptable practice in the era, though one that would establish a troubling pattern. This first instance of familial marriage wasn't technically consanguineous, but it set a precedent that subsequent generations would follow with increasingly destructive consequences. By the 1890s, the second generation of Ozark Blackwoods had grown up in nearly complete isolation. Church records from a traveling Methodist preacher show that the family attended services only twice annually. Their children received no formal education, and interaction with neighboring communities dwindled with each passing year. Jeremiah Blackwood, born in 1888, was Jacob's grandson. County marriage records show that in 1908 he wed his first cousin, Sarah Blackwood. Their union was the third instance of close family marriage in the Blackwood line. Local Dr. Raymond Wells documented concerns about their children as early as 1912, noting unusual facial development in their firstborn son, who died of pneumonia at age 3. That family started turning strange after the Great War, said Mabel Thornton, whose family owned a general store 10 miles from the Blackwood homestead. Jeremiah would come down maybe twice a year for supplies, always paid in pelts and handmade items, never cash, wouldn't hardly speak. Last time I saw him might have been 29 or 30. After that, it was like they just vanished into those hills. What happened during those years of exhilaration remains largely unrecorded, but court documents from 1937 reveal disturbing details. When authorities finally intervened, following Dr. Harrington's report, they discovered that after Sarah had delivered the 3 daughters, Jeremiah had enacted a complete separation from the outside world. The cabin's windows were boarded. A series of traps surrounded the property. The family subsisted entirely on what they could hunt, gather, or grow. Most disturbing were the journals found in Jeremiah's possession, documenting his belief that his family represented a purification of bloodlines. He developed an elaborate pseudo-religious justification for consanguinity, believing that the unusual appearances of his daughters weren't deformities, but rather the emergence of the true form that had been diluted by outside blood in previous generations. These writings reveal the dangerous intersection of isolation, misinformation, and religious distortion that can occur in closed communities. The Blackwood case demonstrates how completely a family can detach from societal norms when geographic isolation combines with ideological separation. The winter of 1934 had been particularly harsh in the Ozarks. Local weather records document an unprecedented snowfall that left many remote areas completely cut off for weeks. For the already isolated Blackwoods, this extreme weather likely eliminated what minimal contact remained with the outside world. It was during this winter that Sarah Blackwood died, according to Jeremiah's journals, leaving the three sisters entirely under their father's control and twisted worldview. By 1937, when Dr. Harrington stumbled upon their cabin, the situation had deteriorated to a point where intervention was inevitable. Yet the case raises difficult questions about society's responsibility toward isolated communities and the balance between freedom of lifestyle and protection of vulnerable individuals. When Dr. Thomas Harrington returned to Springfield, Missouri, with his findings in late 1937, he faced initial skepticism from medical colleagues. The photographs he had taken of the Blackwood sisters with his Kodak Brownie camera were deemed disturbing to be authentic by Dr. William Foster, head of the Missouri State Medical Association. It wasn't until a second expedition, which included Dr. Foster himself and two deputies from the Carter County Sheriff's Office, that the full scope of the Blackwood situation was acknowledged. The temperature had fallen below freezing as the team made their way up the barely discernible path to Cane Creek Hollow on November 23, 1937. A light snow dusted the ground, making the expedition particularly challenging. What they found upon arrival would be documented in medical journals for decades to come. The sisters exhibit a constellation of congenital abnormalities consistent with extensive consanguinity, wrote Dr. Forster in his subsequent report to state authorities. The probability of these conditions occurring randomly in three siblings without a genetic relationship is effectively zero. This represents perhaps the most severe case of consanguinity-related disorders documented in modern American medical literature. The detail of the sisters' conditions reveals the devastating biological reality of multi-generational inbreeding. Eliza, the eldest, displayed the most dramatic facial deformities. Her mandibular progonophism, protruding lower jaw, extended nearly 2 inches beyond her upper jaw. Hypertrichosis, excessive hair growth, covered approximately 40% of her face and neck, giving her the wolf-like appearance that had spawned local legends. X-ray examinations later revealed she had an additional partial row of teeth behind her normal dentition, a rare condition called hyperdontia. Her fingers exhibited syndactyly fusion between the middle and ring fingers on both hands, and her spine showed significant scoliosis. Mary, the middle sister, had developed what appeared to be a form of acromegaly with enlarged hands, feet, and facial features, though this was determined to be a genetic disorder rather than the usual pituitary cause. Her spine had curved so dramatically that she stood nearly 8 inches shorter than her actual height. She exhibited severe intellectual disability, with an estimated mental age of approximately 5 years. Ruth, the youngest, showed the most normal facial structure, but had extremely underdeveloped lower limbs. She moved primarily by dragging herself with her arms, which had developed unusual musculature as a result. Despite her physical limitations, Ruth displayed moments of normal cognitive function, occasionally speaking clearly to the doctors. The most haunting aspect, Dr. Forster would later write in his private memoirs, wasn't the physical deformities, shocking as they were. It was the sisters' expressions, a mixture of fear, confusion, and something akin to shame, as though they somehow understood they weren't as they should be. That human awareness, trapped within bodies so malformed, creates an emotional impact that mere clinical description fails to convey. I've lived in these hills all my life, and I've never seen anything like those poor girls. They didn't ask to be born that way. When I think about how people treated them like animals instead of helping them, it breaks my heart. If you feel the same, type "they deserved better" in the comments. The genetic analysis, though limited by 1930s technology, identified multiple recessive disorders concentrated through the Blackwood lineage. Modern geneticists, reviewing the case records, suggest that the sisters likely suffered from a combination of conditions including Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, congenital hypothyroidism, and several rare metabolic disorders, all exacerbated by severe malnutrition. What makes the Blackwood case scientifically significant is not just the presence of genetic abnormalities, but their unusual clustering and severity. Typical cousin marriages increase the risk of birth defects by approximately 4 to 7% compared to the general population. However, when consanguinity occurs across multiple generations, the risk increases exponentially with each successive generation, as recessive genes become increasingly concentrated. By the fourth generation of inbreeding, which the Blackwood sisters represented, the genetic damage had become catastrophic. Their case stands as one of the most extreme examples of consanguinity's effects in medical literature. The sisters' conditions were further compounded by complete absence of medical care, poor nutrition, and environmental toxins. Analysis of water samples from Cane Creek revealed high levels of lead contamination, likely from abandoned mining operations upstream, another factor that would have exacerbated their developmental problems. When asked how the community could have allowed the situation to deteriorate so dramatically, local resident Emmett Pruitt told investigators, "Those hills hide things, always have. Ain't nobody's business what happens up in those hollers, at least that's how folks thought." Now I reckon we all got to live with knowing what happened while we looked away. The transformation of the Blackwood sisters from human tragedy to supernatural legend represents a fascinating study in folklore development. By the time Dr. Harrington discovered them in 1937, stories of the wolf women of Cane Creek had already circulated throughout the Ozarks for nearly a decade. These tales reveal how communities often process disturbing realities by recasting them into familiar mythological frameworks. The earliest documented reference to the wolf women appears in a 1931 letter from Reverend Thaddeus Burke to a colleague in St. Louis. "The people here speak of strange creatures in the hills, women by day who transform under moonlight. I believe these are simply unfortunate souls with deformities, yet I cannot convince the local populace otherwise. Fear has overwhelmed Christian charity in this matter." Ozark folklorist Vance Randolph, who collected regional tales throughout the 1930s and 40s, recorded 7 distinct variations of the wolf women legend, from different communities surrounding Cane Creek. The core elements remained consistent: female entities with wolf-like features who howled at night and were said to hunt in the forest. Some versions claimed they could transform completely into wolves. Others maintained they were women cursed for unnamed sins. What's notable in the Ozark wolfwoman legends is how they differ from European werewolf traditions, explained Dr. Eleanor Whitman, professor of folklore studies at the University of Missouri, in a 1956 analysis. European werewolves are typically male and transform by choice or curse for limited periods. The Cane Creek legends describe females who are permanently altered and whose condition is often attributed to bad blood or tainted family lines, a clear reference to the actual consanguinity of the Blackwood family. Translated into supernatural terms, the climate and geography of the Ozarks contributed significantly to the legend's spread and persistence. The dense forests, frequent ground fogs, and deep hollows create natural acoustic phenomena. Sound carries strangely in these hills, sometimes amplifying distant noises while muffling closer ones. The distinctive vocalizations of the Blackwood sisters, described in medical records as high-pitched and arrhythmic due to malformed vocal tracts, would have been transformed by these acoustic conditions into something seemingly inhuman to distant listeners. Local hunting guide Samuel Tucker described an encounter from 1935. "I was tracking deer near Cane Creek when I heard it. Wasn't no animal I recognized. Wasn't rightly human neither. Sort of a wailing that turned to something like laughter. Mist was thick that morning. Saw shapes moving through the trees, hunched over, moving fast. Didn't wait around to see more. Some things a man's better off not knowing too much about." What Tucker likely witnessed was one or more of the Blackwood sisters foraging for food, an activity their father's journals indicate they performed regularly. Their unusual gait, hunched postures, and communication attempts would have appeared profoundly unsettling when glimpsed partially through forest mist. The persistence of the legend, even after the sisters were removed to state care in 1938, demonstrates how folklore becomes self-sustaining. When a 1942 State Forestry Survey team reported hearing unusual sounds near the abandoned Blackwood cabin, locals immediately attributed this to the return of the wolf women, despite the sisters being documented in state care at that time. The actual source was likely timber wolves, which were still occasionally sighted in remote areas of the Ozarks during this period. The legend grew so entrenched that it affected migration patterns in the region. Several families who had considered settling in the Cane Creek area in the early 1940s chose different locations after hearing the tales. This illustrates how folklore can have tangible demographic and economic impacts on communities. People needed those stories, reflected Carter County historian Mildred Jenkins in a 1979 interview. Easier to believe in monsters than face what we let happen to those girls. If they're cursed creatures, wolf women, then nobody's responsible, see? But if they're just unfortunate girls born to inbreeding, left to suffer while everyone looked away, well, that's a harder truth to live with. By the 1950s, the wolf women legend had been incorporated into broader Ozark folklore collections, appearing in tourist pamphlets and regional ghost story anthologies, though typically with the actual names and dates altered or omitted. This commercialization further separated the legend from its tragic origins. What remained consistent across all versions was the central theme of transformation through a bloodline, the essential truth of the Blackwood case translated into mythological terms. The very real genetic catastrophe of consanguinity became a supernatural metamorphosis, more comprehensible to rural communities with limited understanding of genetics, but deep familiarity with folklore traditions. The state's intervention in the Blackwood case in late 1937 marked the beginning of a new chapter, rather than an end to the story. Historical records from the Missouri Department of Public Welfare provide a somber accounting of the sisters' fate after their removal from Cane Creek Hollow. The winter air bit sharply as state authorities transported the three sisters down from the mountains on December 3, 1937. Snow had begun falling heavily, covering the crude dirt road in white. Eliza, Mary, and Ruth Blackwood left the only home they had ever known, wrapped in Army surplus blankets, in the back of a county medical wagon. None of them would ever return to the Ozarks. The removal was necessarily traumatic, wrote social worker Margaret Holloway in her case notes. The sisters had no concept of the outside world beyond their immediate surroundings. The eldest, Eliza, became highly agitated when separated from her siblings, even momentarily. They communicate primarily through a series of vocalizations, comprehensible only to each other, a private language developed in isolation. Jeremiah Blackwood, the father, was arrested and charged with multiple counts of neglect and endangerment. Court records indicate he never acknowledged any wrongdoing, maintaining until his death in a state psychiatric facility in 1943 that he had been preserving the purity of the bloodline. Psychiatric evaluations diagnosed him with delusional disorder, with religious preoccupation, noting that complete isolation had allowed his distorted worldview to flourish unchecked. The sisters were initially housed at the state hospital in Farmington, where they became unwilling celebrities of sorts. Despite official protocols, hospital staff frequently brought visitors to view the wolf women, continuing their dehumanization under the guise of medical interest. This practice only ceased after Dr. Thomas Harrington, who had first discovered the sisters, filed a formal complaint with state authorities in February 1938. These are human beings suffering from severe medical conditions, not carnival attractions, Harrington wrote in his petition. Their continued exploitation demonstrates that we have learned nothing from their tragedy. In response to the complaint, the sisters were separated and transferred to different facilities across the state. A well-intentioned but ultimately devastating decision that broke their only remaining social bonds. Medical records indicate that their health declined rapidly following the separation. Ruth, the youngest, was transferred to the Northwest Missouri State Hospital, where she died of pneumonia in 1939, just 2 years after being discovered. She was 21 years old. Mary lived until 1944, spending her final years in the state school for the severely disabled in Marshall, Missouri. Attendants noted that she would frequently call out sounds believed to be her sisters' names. Eliza survived the longest, living until 1952 in the state hospital in St. Louis, though records indicate she never adapted to institutional life, remaining withdrawn and often refusing food. The case eventually catalyzed significant changes in Missouri's public health policies. The Blackwood Protocols, established in 1940, created the first systematic approach to monitoring isolated rural communities for public health concerns. These protocols emphasized education rather than punishment and recognized the role that extreme isolation played in enabling harmful practices to continue unchallenged. The tragic irony, noted Public Health Administrator William Danforth in a 1945 assessment, is that had these measures been in place a generation earlier, the Blackwood sisters might have led normal lives. Their conditions were entirely preventable through basic public health intervention. The scientific legacy of the case extends into modern genetic research. The detailed medical documentation has provided valuable historical data on the progressive effects of multi-generational consanguinity. A1987 genetic study at Washington University in St. Louis used the Blackwood case records to help identify several recessive gene mutations that become catastrophic when concentrated through inbreeding. The social impact of the case extended well beyond the immediate region. News reports, though sensationalized, raised national awareness about rural isolation and public health. A 1939 federal initiative to expand rural health services cited the Blackwood case as demonstrating the urgent need for medical outreach to America's most isolated communities. The original Blackwood cabin was destroyed in a forest fire in 1952, erasing the physical evidence of their existence. Today, Cane Creek Hollow remains largely uninhabited, though hikers occasionally report finding stone foundations and abandoned farm implements deep in the woods. Local residents still tend to avoid the area after dark. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in how the case transformed from medical tragedy to cultural touchstone. The Wolf Women legend continues to appear in regional folklore collections, though few connect it to the real Blackwood sisters. The transformation of their story demonstrates both humanity's need to mythologize suffering and our reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies fail their most vulnerable members. As historian James Rollins observed in his 1968 examination of the case, in creating monsters from victims, we absolve ourselves of responsibility. The real horror of Cane Creek wasn't mythical wolf women, but the very human failure of compassion that allowed 3 innocent women to suffer their entire lives from preventable conditions while a community looked away, preferring to tell frightening stories rather than face an uncomfortable truth. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The disturbing truths about America's hidden history of genetic isolation will forever change how you see our rural past. If you watched until the end, leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can get to know you and learn who really enjoys the stories on this channel. Don't forget to like and share this video with someone who appreciates learning about these hidden chapters of American history. Blackwood sisters' legacy reminds us that legends often begin with real human suffering, and that our responsibility to vulnerable communities doesn't end where the paved roads do. Their story, finally told in full, ensures that they are remembered not as monsters of folklore, but as human beings whose tragedy should never be repeated.